Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. When American airmen began fighting over Europe, they quickly learned a brutal truth. Speed and agility alone were not enough. German defenses were layered, disciplined, and lethal. Fighters attacked from above. Flak filled the sky. Aircraft were torn apart in seconds. Survival required something more than elegance. It required strength. The P-47 Thunderbolt was born from this reality. Unlike many fighters of World War II, the Thunderbolt was not designed to be graceful. It was massive, heavy, and powered by one of the largest engines ever mounted on a single-engine fighter. Its creators at Republic Aviation understood that American pilots needed an aircraft that could survive punishment, fight at high altitude, and still bring its pilot home. At first glance, the P-47 looked wrong. It was enormous compared to aircraft like the Spitfire or Messerschmitt Bf-109. Its radial Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine dominated the nose. The fuselage was thick. The wings were broad. Early critics doubted it could compete with lighter fighters. Some pilots joked that it flew by brute force alone. But brute force was exactly the point. The Thunderbolt was built around survivability. Armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire risk. The massive radial engine could absorb damage that would destroy liquid-cooled fighters instantly. Control systems were redundant. Even with cylinders shot out and control surfaces damaged, the aircraft often remained flyable. Firepower was overwhelming. 8 .50-caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings, delivering a wall of lead capable of shredding aircraft, vehicles, and ground targets alike. In combat, a short burst from a P-47 could erase anything caught in front of it. High-altitude performance was another key strength. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharger allowed it to fight effectively at altitudes where many enemy fighters struggled. This made it ideal for escorting bombers early in the air war, before long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang arrived in large numbers. American pilots initially struggled to understand how to fight in the P-47. Turning battles against lighter German fighters often ended badly. But once pilots learned to exploit the Thunderbolt's strengths, diving speed, firepower, and durability, the aircraft became deadly. The P-47 could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, attack from above, and escape without being caught. The Thunderbolt's size also gave pilots confidence. They knew they could take hits and keep flying. Stories spread quickly of aircraft returning with entire sections missing, engines damaged, wings torn, yet still landing safely. This reputation mattered. It allowed pilots to fight aggressively, knowing the aircraft would protect them when things went wrong. By 1943, the P-47 was arriving in large numbers in Europe. It would soon become one of the most important fighters of the U.S. Army Air Forces. It escorted bombers, hunted German fighters, and later transformed into one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. The Thunderbolt did not look like a hero's airplane, but it became one. Because in World War II, survival was victory, and the P-47 was built to survive. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first met the Luftwaffe over Europe, the outcome was far from certain. German pilots were experienced, confident, and flying aircraft that had dominated the skies since the beginning of the war. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190 were lighter, more agile, and well suited for close-range combat. Early encounters exposed a dangerous gap between what the Thunderbolt could do on paper and how it was actually being used in the air. Many American pilots initially tried to fly the P-47 like smaller fighters. They attempted turning battles, staying close to the enemy, and matching maneuver for maneuver. This was a mistake. In horizontal combat, the Thunderbolt's size and weight became liabilities. German pilots exploited this ruthlessly, climbing above American formations, diving into attacks, and escaping before Thunderbolts could respond effectively. Losses followed, and confidence wavered. The turning point came not through redesign of the aircraft, but through a shift in tactics. American commanders and veteran pilots began emphasizing energy fighting. The Thunderbolt was not meant to dance with enemy fighters. It was meant to strike like a hammer. With its powerful engine and turbo supercharger, the P-47 excelled at high-altitude combat. It could climb well, dive faster than almost any opponent, and maintain control at extreme speeds. Once pilots learned to fight vertically, diving from above, firing, and then climbing back to altitude, the balance began to change. This approach suited the Thunderbolt perfectly. German pilots discovered that once a P-47 committed to a dive, it was almost impossible to follow safely. The Thunderbolt could exceed speeds that would cause structural failure in lighter aircraft. Even if pursued, the P-47's rugged construction often allowed it to absorb hits that would cripple a Bf 109 or FW 190. Many German pilots learned the hard way that chasing a Thunderbolt downhill was a losing gamble. Training adapted quickly. American pilots were drilled in boom and zoom tactics, formation discipline, and mutual support. The emphasis shifted away from individual heroics toward coordinated attacks. Wingmen protected each other. Squadrons worked together to maintain altitude advantage. Once this system was in place, Thunderbolt units became increasingly effective. Firepower amplified these tactics. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated bursts capable of destroying enemy aircraft in a single pass. Pilots learned to fire only when they had a clear shot, conserving ammunition and maximizing effect. Short, controlled bursts replaced long sprays. Hits were devastating. As experience grew, Thunderbolt pilots gained confidence in their aircraft's durability. They pressed attacks more aggressively, knowing they could survive damage. Stories circulated of pilots returning with engines shot through, control surfaces destroyed, and wings riddled with holes. These were not rare exceptions. They became part of the Thunderbolt's reputation. The aircraft earned a nickname among its pilots: the Jug. Heavy, tough, and unstoppable. German pilots took notice. Combat reports began describing the Thunderbolt as difficult to kill and dangerous when used correctly. Luftwaffe aces warned younger pilots not to engage P-47s in prolonged fights. The psychological edge began to shift. Where American pilots had once been cautious, they now attacked with purpose. Where German pilots had once dominated engagements, they now faced an enemy that could not be easily broken. The Thunderbolt's early struggles became a lesson in adaptation. American air power did not rely on perfection from the start. It relied on learning faster than the enemy. The P-47 was not redesigned to win the air war. Its pilots were. By late 1943, Thunderbolt units were no longer simply surviving encounters with the Luftwaffe. They were winning them. The aircraft that had seemed too big and too heavy was now one of the most feared fighters in the European skies. And this was only one part of its transformation. As American air superiority increased and the Luftwaffe weakened, the role of the Thunderbolt would expand beyond fighter combat. The aircraft that had learned to fight German fighters would soon turn its guns toward the ground and change the war below forever. Before the arrival of long-range escort fighters in large numbers, the P-47 Thunderbolt carried a burden that few aircraft could endure. American bombers were pushing deeper into occupied Europe, striking industrial targets that lay far beyond the reach of earlier fighters. Someone had to protect them for as long as possible, in skies filled with flak and experienced German interceptors. For much of 1943, that responsibility fell on the Thunderbolt. Escort duty was unforgiving. Bomber formations moved slowly and predictably, forcing fighters to fly at reduced speed and altitude. Thunderbolt pilots often found themselves constrained by the need to stay close to the bombers, unable to fully exploit their aircraft's strengths. German fighters took advantage of this, attacking from superior positions and then disengaging. Losses were heavy, and every mission tested discipline and nerves. Range was the critical limitation. Even with external drop tanks, early Thunderbolt escorts could not remain with bombers all the way to the deepest targets in Germany. Pilots escorted as far as fuel allowed, then turned back, knowing that beyond that point, the bombers would be exposed. This moment, when escorts peeled away, became a deadly signal to the Luftwaffe. German fighters waited for it and attacked immediately. Thunderbolt pilots understood the stakes. They pushed their aircraft to the limits of fuel endurance, sometimes returning to base with engines sputtering on fumes. Some misjudged and ditched in the Channel. Others crash-landed in fields on the English coast. The price of extending escort even a few more minutes could be severe, but those minutes mattered. Despite these challenges, the P-47 proved indispensable. Its presence reduced bomber losses during the most vulnerable phases of the mission. When German fighters did engage, Thunderbolt pilots fought aggressively, drawing attackers away from bomber formations and forcing the Luftwaffe to commit resources earlier and more often. Every intercepted attack saved lives, even if the bombers were later left alone. The Thunderbolt's high-altitude performance was particularly valuable during this period. Many German interceptions occurred at altitudes where the P-47 could still fight effectively. Pilots climbed hard to meet incoming threats, using their aircraft's turbo supercharger to maintain power where other fighters struggled. Once engaged, Thunderbolts struck quickly and disengaged, refusing prolonged turning fights. Durability again played a decisive role. Escort missions often involved long exposure to flak while flying near bomber streams. Thunderbolts absorbed damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Pilots returned with shrapnel holes through wings, fuselages, and control surfaces, yet still landed safely. These survivals mattered not just tactically, but psychologically. Confidence grew with every damaged aircraft that came home. The cost remained high. Escort pilots watched bombers fall when fuel forced them to turn back. The sense of leaving comrades behind weighed heavily. Many Thunderbolt pilots later recalled escort duty as one of the most emotionally difficult parts of the war, not because of combat alone, but because of what they could not prevent. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang would eventually change this dynamic, providing true end-to-end escort. But before that shift occurred, the Thunderbolt held the line. It carried the bomber war through its most dangerous phase, absorbing losses, buying time and wearing down the Luftwaffe through constant engagement. This period defined the Thunderbolt's reputation among bomber crews. They knew the P-47 could not stay forever, but they trusted it while it was there. The sight of large silver Thunderbolts weaving above formations became a symbol of resistance in skies that often felt hostile and unforgiving. By late 1943, the strategic situation began to shift. German fighter strength was eroding. American training and production were accelerating. The Thunderbolt's role was about to change again, this time from guardian of bombers to executioner of everything that moved below. The aircraft that had endured escort duty would soon unleash its full potential, and the battlefield would feel it. As American air superiority increased and the Luftwaffe weakened, the role of the P-47 Thunderbolt changed fundamentally. What had begun as a high-altitude escort fighter evolved into one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of World War II. This transformation was not accidental. It was the result of battlefield necessity, aircraft design, and pilots who learned how to turn overwhelming firepower into decisive results on the ground. The Thunderbolt was uniquely suited for this role. Its size, once criticized, became an advantage. The aircraft could carry heavy bomb loads and rockets without sacrificing stability. 8 50-caliber machine guns delivered a devastating volume of fire, capable of shredding vehicles, locomotives, artillery positions, and infantry concentrations. Its rugged construction allowed it to survive intense ground fire and return to base repeatedly, even when heavily damaged. As Allied armies prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, Thunderbolt units began flying armed reconnaissance and interdiction missions across occupied France and Belgium. These missions were flown at low altitude, often just above treetop level. Pilots searched for trains, convoys, bridges, and troop movements. Once a target was found, the attack was immediate and violent. Speed and surprise were essential. The goal was to strike before the enemy could disperse or take cover. German forces quickly learned to fear the P-47. Its dive speed was tremendous, allowing pilots to attack almost vertically and pull out at the last moment. Lighter aircraft struggled to match this profile. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky during these attacks, but the Thunderbolt's armor and radial engine absorbed punishment that would destroy other fighters. Many pilots returned with holes punched clean through wings and fuselage, oil streaming from damaged engines, yet still flying. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. Movement during daylight became dangerous. Columns halted, vehicles were abandoned, and supplies were destroyed before reaching the front. The sound of a diving Thunderbolt became a warning of imminent destruction. Soldiers learned to scatter and hide at the first sight of the aircraft, often abandoning equipment in panic. Air power was no longer distant. It was immediate and unavoidable. After D-Day, the Thunderbolt's ground attack role expanded dramatically. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy, P-47s operated from forward airfields close to the front lines. They flew constant sorties in direct support of advancing ground units. Pilots coordinated with forward air controllers, striking targets only minutes ahead of American and Allied troops. This close cooperation saved lives and accelerated advances that might otherwise have stalled under enemy fire. Railways became prime targets. Thunderbolt pilots destroyed locomotives, rail yards, and bridges, crippling German logistics. Fuel shortages worsened. Units were unable to reposition or reinforce effectively. Artillery pieces were abandoned. Tanks ran out of fuel. The destruction inflicted by ground attack aircraft compounded the damage already done by strategic bombing, creating a system-wide collapse of German mobility. The Thunderbolt's effectiveness was not limited to Western Europe. Similar tactics were used in Italy, where mountainous terrain made ground movement slow and vulnerable. P-47s attacked supply routes through narrow passes, trapping German units and preventing withdrawal. In these environments, the aircraft's endurance and firepower were invaluable. Losses were significant. Ground attack missions were among the most dangerous flown by American pilots. Anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, and even rifles posed constant threats. Pilots accepted these risks because the results were undeniable. Every destroyed convoy, every disabled train, every silenced gun reduced the enemy's ability to fight. By late 1944, the P-47 had earned a new reputation. It was no longer just a fighter. It was a battlefield weapon, directly shaping the outcome of ground operations. Infantry units trusted it. Tank crews relied on it. Commanders planned advances knowing that Thunderbolts would be overhead, ready to strike. The aircraft that had once struggled to find its role had become indispensable. It did not simply support the advance, it drove it. And as Allied forces pushed toward Germany itself, the Thunderbolt would face its final and most demanding missions against an enemy that was collapsing, but still capable of killing. From D-Day to the Rhine, Thunderbolts in the final European campaigns. When Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was already transforming the battlefield. Air superiority had been secured, but turning that advantage into victory on the ground required constant, aggressive pressure. From the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, Thunderbolt pilots flew some of the most intense and decisive missions of the European war. In the days following D-Day, German forces attempted to regroup and counterattack. Roads filled with columns of troops, armor, and supply vehicles moving toward the front. Thunderbolt units operating from England and newly established airstrips in France were tasked with stopping them. These missions were immediate, violent, and often chaotic. Pilots were sent out with minimal briefing time, guided by intelligence reports and radio calls from ground units under fire. The Thunderbolt excelled in this environment. Its ability to carry bombs and rockets allowed pilots to strike hardened targets, while its 8 machine guns shredded vehicles and infantry alike. Attacks were often conducted in pairs or small flights, diving steeply to deliver ordnance before pulling out under heavy fire. The aircraft's dive speed allowed it to enter and exit the target area faster than most anti-aircraft gunners could react. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and advanced across France, Thunderbolts became a constant presence. Pilots flew armed reconnaissance along roads, rail lines, and river crossings, hunting anything that moved. Trains were destroyed in spectacular fashion, their boilers exploding under machine gun fire. Bridges were bombed repeatedly, forcing German units to detour or abandon heavy equipment. Fuel trucks burned, cutting off already strained supplies. The effect on German operations was devastating. Movement by day became nearly impossible. Units attempted to move at night, slowing advances and increasing confusion. Command and control broke down as communications were disrupted, and officers were killed in attacks. Thunderbolt pilots often reported seeing enemy soldiers abandon vehicles and scatter into fields at the first sight of approaching aircraft. During the autumn of 1944, the Thunderbolt's role expanded further. As Allied forces approached Germany's borders, P-47s attacked defensive positions, artillery batteries, and troop concentrations. These missions were flown close to the front lines, sometimes within sight of American infantry. Coordination between pilots and forward air controllers improved steadily, allowing strikes to be delivered within minutes of requests. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated the Thunderbolt's importance once again. Poor weather initially grounded Allied air power, allowing German forces to advance. When skies cleared, Thunderbolts and other fighters returned in force. P-47s attacked German columns trapped on narrow roads, destroying tanks, trucks, and artillery. Fuel shortages worsened as convoys were annihilated from the air. The German offensive collapsed under combined ground and air pressure. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, Thunderbolt units followed closely. They struck retreating units, destroyed remaining infrastructure, and prevented organized resistance. Even as Germany's defeat became inevitable, missions remained dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire was still lethal, and desperate defenders fought on. Losses continued until the final weeks. By the time American forces reached deep into Germany, the Thunderbolt had earned a fearsome reputation. German soldiers knew its silhouette and sound. Allied ground troops trusted it implicitly. Commanders planned advances knowing that P-47s would clear the way ahead. From D-Day to the Rhine, the Thunderbolt proved that air power could directly shape ground combat. It did not merely support the advance, it accelerated it, broke resistance, and saved lives by crushing enemy movement before contact was made. The war in Europe was nearing its end. Yet for Thunderbolt pilots, the final missions were often the most dangerous, flown against an enemy that had nothing left to lose. 2 chapters remain: the end of the war and the legacy of an aircraft that refused to fall from the sky. The last missions: survival, exhaustion, and victory in sight. By early 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt was flying in a war that was clearly ending, but not yet finished. The German army was retreating on all fronts, cities lay in ruins, and fuel shortages crippled what remained of the Luftwaffe. On maps and in briefings, victory appeared inevitable. In the cockpit of a Thunderbolt, however, the danger was still immediate and unforgiving. Thunderbolt pilots flew almost daily. Many had already completed long combat tours, yet the demand for experienced pilots kept them in action. Fatigue became a constant companion. Sleep was irregular. Weather over Europe remained harsh, with cold, cloud, and icing common even in spring. Aircraft were flown hard, often from rough forward airfields hastily carved out of farmland or damaged runways. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the jugs serviceable. The nature of missions in these final months was brutal. Ground attack sorties dominated. Pilots were sent to hunt retreating columns, destroy bridges, and suppress defensive positions ahead of advancing American and Allied troops. These missions were flown at low altitude, where anti-aircraft fire was dense and unpredictable. Light flak guns, machine guns, and even rifles could bring down an aircraft in seconds. German resistance, though weakened, was often desperate. Units with no hope of relief fought on stubbornly. Anti-aircraft gunners fired until the last moment. Thunderbolt pilots described fields and roads erupting in tracer fire as they dove toward targets. The aircraft's armor and rugged engine saved many lives, but not all. Losses continued right up to the end. The psychological pressure of late-war missions was unique. pilots knew the war was almost over. News filtered through of German units surrendering, of Allied armies approaching major cities. Yet every mission still carried the risk of being killed just weeks or days before peace. Veterans later recalled this period as one of the hardest to endure. The fear was sharper because the end was so close. Despite exhaustion, discipline held. Thunderbolt squadrons continued to fly aggressively. The aircraft's ability to absorb damage encouraged pilots to press attacks even under heavy fire. Many returned with engines leaking oil, wings riddled with holes, or control systems barely responding. These damaged aircraft became symbols of endurance, proof that the Thunderbolt could take punishment and still bring its pilot home. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced deep into Germany, Thunderbolts struck retreat routes relentlessly. Bridges were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Rail lines were cut repeatedly. Units attempting to regroup were scattered from the air. The combination of air attack and ground advance left German forces with few options and little cohesion. The Thunderbolt's presence also shaped the battlefield psychologically. German soldiers learned to recognize its shape and sound. The deep roar of its radial engine often preceded destruction. Allied infantry, by contrast, drew confidence from seeing P-47s overhead. Pilots and ground troops developed mutual trust. Requests for air support were answered quickly, sometimes within minutes. In April 1945, as Allied armies closed in on the heart of Germany, Thunderbolt missions continued almost until the last days of fighting. There was no dramatic final sortie. The war simply slowed, then stopped. One day, pilots were armed and ready. The next, missions were canceled. Orders came down to stand down. For many Thunderbolt pilots, the end felt unreal. The routine of briefings, takeoffs, and combat had defined their lives for months or years. Suddenly it was gone. Relief was mixed with emptiness. Thoughts turned immediately to friends who had not survived to see this moment. The P-47 had flown through the entire arc of the European air war, from escorting bombers under constant threat to dominating the battlefield below. It had adapted to every role demanded of it. In the final months, it did what it had always done best: endure. The war in Europe was ending. One chapter remains: the fate of the pilots after victory and the legacy of the Thunderbolt itself. Homecoming, pilots, peace, and a world without war. When the war in Europe finally ended, the silence that followed felt unnatural. For P-47 Thunderbolt pilots, the sky that had been a battlefield for years suddenly became empty. Engines no longer roared at dawn. Briefing rooms that once buzzed with tension stood quiet. The transition from constant danger to peace was abrupt, and for many, deeply unsettling. Victory did not arrive with celebration in the cockpits. It arrived with orders to stand down. Aircraft were grounded, ammunition was removed, maps were taken off briefing boards. Pilots who had spent months flying under fire now found themselves waiting, often without clear instructions, wondering what came next. Some units were told to prepare for redeployment to the Pacific. Others were scheduled for demobilization. The uncertainty was difficult to process after years of structured combat routines. Returning home was not the simple relief many had imagined. Thunderbolt pilots came back to a country that had continued living while they had been fighting. Families expected normality, friends wanted stories. Parades and celebrations honored victory. But few civilians understood what low-altitude ground attack missions had been like, or what it meant to fly through flak knowing one hit could end everything instantly. Many pilots chose silence rather than explanation. Physical exhaustion faded faster than psychological strain. Some pilots struggled with restlessness, sleep problems, and sudden flashes of memory triggered by sounds or smells. Others felt disconnected, as if the world they returned to moved too slowly. During the war, decisions had been immediate and absolute. In peace, choices felt trivial and confusing. The Thunderbolt itself disappeared quickly. Thousands of P-47s were declared surplus within months. Aircraft that had survived dozens of combat missions were parked in rows, stripped for parts, or scrapped entirely. For pilots and ground crews, watching these machines dismantled was painful. The Thunderbolt had not been just a tool, it had been a shield, a weapon, and often the reason a pilot survived to come home. Some pilots remained in the military, transitioning into the newly formed United States Air Force or staying with the Army Air Forces during its reorganization. Others entered civilian aviation, becoming airline pilots, test pilots, or instructors. The experience of flying high-performance aircraft under extreme stress proved valuable in the post-war aviation boom. Yet many avoided flying altogether, leaving the sky behind after what it had demanded of them. Reunions in later years revealed how deeply the war had shaped these men. Former Thunderbolt pilots recognized each other instantly, even after decades. Stories returned in fragments, dives through flak, emergency landings, last radio calls. Names of lost friends were spoken softly, often followed by long pauses. Survival brought pride, but also a sense of responsibility to remember those who did not return. The world without war felt fragile. Pilots who had seen how quickly order collapsed understood that peace was not permanent by default. Many became quietly committed to stability, education, and rebuilding. The Thunderbolt generation carried its lessons into civilian life, shaping post-war America in ways that were rarely visible but deeply influential. For these men, victory was not a moment. It was a transition. The end of the war did not erase fear, loss, or memory. It simply removed the daily requirement to face them. What remained was experience, hard, permanent, and defining. Only one chapter remains: the legacy of the Thunderbolt itself, and why it is remembered as one of the most important American aircraft of World War II. World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.